Hello, Simone. This is going to be a spicy episode with a lot of data. We are going to be talking about a study and a write-up on the study. The study was called Pervasive Findings of Directional Selection Realize the Promise of Ancient DNA to Elucidate Human Adaptation. Specifically, they took 8,433 corpses from a period that went from 14,000 years ago to modern times, and then 6,510 contemporary people to develop baselines. And they determined how much various things that we know have genetic correlates today, how those genetic correlates changed throughout history.
Wow.
And so we're going to be talking about things like intelligence, earning potential, schizophrenia potential,
Oh my
a
gosh.
race-ship ratio, how white people were, because this was all done in the European population. In
Right.
an article that was bemoaning this called David Reich Vindicates Corin and Harpin's 10,000 Year Explosion, they were bemoaning that they're like, it's so funny that like you cannot do this sort of work, even though we have tons and tons and tons of like Native American skeletons and stuff like that, or skeletons from different regions. They're all like now like reburying them and stuff, like destroying these historic artifacts because it's like, oh, this is all like Western supremacy. But what it means is like nobody cares when you mess with like white people skeletons. So they, with all these other skeletons, they're just not going to have good data, and we're destroying the data to know about ethnic minorities, but we will know what happened with white people. And one of the interesting things that I guess I can go into first with some of the first graphs I shared with you, Simone, if you go to WhatsApp, is white people being white is actually a fairly modern thing.
What?
And
Okay.
historically, we probably did not look that white. Specifically, if you go 4,000 years ago or earlier, a lot of the genes, and this is just like across genes here. So you can look at this in the first one.
Look at that. Yeah.
Associate with whiteness or a darker skin color were just significantly more common. And actually, a big part of this happened in the last 2,000 years. It was like big spikes there. And so the idea of, for example, Jesus being black or dark skinned, he was almost certainly more dark skinned than the most dark skinned Europeans today.
So all those Mormon Jesus paintings don't really.
He was definitely not fair-skinned, yes.
Well,
Very interesting, though, that white skin is a fairly modern evolutionary phenomenon, but one that has been regularly selected for since about 6,000 years ago.
interesting.
You also see a similar phenomenon here with hair.
Yeah, look at that.
So straight hair / baldness increase. So you've seen the hair within the European population becoming much, much straighter over time. We would have had much hair, or is that an offensive word? Hair?
I do not know. Maybe we can say more textured hair.
More textured hair in a historic phenomenon. And but also baldness came along with this.
That is interesting. Are baldness and straight hair known to be correlated genetically?
Apparently the genetics that code for them are correlated, yeah.
That is interesting. All right.
Same was light hair. This didn't start really getting selected for until about 4,000 years ago. So we probably all had black hair similar to Asians or Africans before this.
That is interesting.
So
so pale blonde people are like these new offshoot mutants, and everyone else is the norm.
Genuinely new mutants that over a certain period of history became common because they outcompeted other neighboring populations. So body fat percentage I found really interesting. If you're looking at this one here, one is that in the past, it looks like a few hundred years, there's just been this really sharp, rapid decline in the genetics we correlate with body fat percentage since industrialization.
So we're thinner now. Am I reading this right? I'm bad.
Yeah. Now, obviously, this has changed. If you look at the recent genetic data, actually, body fat percentage predictors alongside IQ predictors are
Uh-huh.
the two things that are most tied to the low fertility of a person. Like if I'm
That
looking
and
for
I think,
genetic
yeah,
correlate to low,
not IQ, but low educational attainment.
yeah,
So
low
it's
educational attainment and high body fat correlate to having lots of kids in the
right,
current context.
right.
But it looks like post the Industrial Revolution, you had an opposite pressure, and you had a very strong pressure, as you can see here, against body fat since the Agricultural Revolution, from a period of about 10,000 to 8,000 years ago.
That is interesting. It's hard for me to imagine a world in which we wouldn't be selecting for higher body fat. Why would we be selecting for leaner people? Is it perhaps that body fat gets in the way of agricultural collection? I mean, we
No,
would need
so
to be
the
leaner when we were
basically what
hunting
you
and
have here
foraging.
is granaries, is really what you're seeing the first selection event. Is do the people have the capacity to survive the winter and other lean periods with stores of food? Like, do they have
Mm,
food
yeah, so in
storage?
other words, is the food storage exogenous or endogenous? Is it outside the body or inside the
Exactly.
body? I see. That's interesting.
Um,
Okay, that makes sense
and
then.
then I think that that's likely also what we're seeing with the Industrial Revolution with canned foods and everything like that.
Mm,
You are always better if you're trying to, optimize for like the fitness and ability to do physical tasks of being very lean. You don't
yeah,
want to keep a lot of this. It's an expensive way to store your calories.
that's true.
Um,
Yeah, yeah, I guess that there are the hazards and the downsides, both from a constrained movement standpoint and from the health burdens. But if you don't have a choice, then you do need to store it. That's very interesting. Wow.
right? Um,
Yeah.
and I also think here, what is causing us to be selecting for fatness now? I think it's that basically within our current society, the less wealthy you are, when you're in this desperate degree of poverty, a certain degree of maladaptiveness to competing within our society leads to genetic fitness within this society, i.e., the ability to outcompete others genetically.
Hmm.
So if you're the type of person who's living off of Medicare or the government and staying at home 24/7, you're just going to have a lot more kids, and you can see this in the data. And so that's what ends up selecting for like high body fat again. Now that we have this pathologically caring society that just won't say, well, obviously they they are not, we shouldn't be supporting somebody who is so fat that they've grown into their bed. Anyway,
Wow.
so we'll go to the next one here. Waist to hip ratio I found really interesting. So with waist to hip ratio, you can see it going down over time, but the big drop in waist to hip ratio happened with the agricultural revolution, where it basically went down to about a third of what it used to be, maybe even like a tenth of what it used to be, and then back up for a period.
And
So
that's so interesting because the thing I immediately think of are those Venus statues that have
yes, and they've got the huge waist to hip ratio
quite sizable hips
and fat. Yes, they were
and they're
fat and
quite
had sizable
fat.
hips, which
And this checks out now. Well, they
that would have
were
applied, yeah,
fatter
that
and
women
they
of that
had
period,
bigger
they
hips.
they may not be as cartoony as we imagine them to be today. They
Yeah.
may have been describing what women actually looked like, or the idealized or high status woman, which
Yeah.
was, and another thing about the Venus statues, which I've noticed, and I hadn't noticed before, now that you mentioned this, is even the European ones had, like, I don't know what to call it, African style hair. I'm
I
trying to
don't
find a
remember them having
non-offensive way to say
heads.
it.
They mostly did not have heads.
No, no, many of them had, like, heads was like it almost looks like really, little, like, grown in micro dreads is, I guess, what I'd call it,
Oh, interesting.
which was probably common in the Europeans at the time. And I'd also note that a lot of the Venus statuaries are done on darker stone, which may have been intentional. They may have just been
Could be,
depicting
yeah,
what
because
the
everyone had
Europeans
darker
looked like
skin.
during that
Yeah,
period.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
And so the guys who like the big waist to hip ratio, they are primeval men, you could say. Now, why did this change happen? It might have been due to survival rates of wives after, like, basically level of medical technology,
Oh.
where it's okay to risk a woman's life in childbirth if it makes her more efficient on the farm. Because somebody with these really wide hips, it causes problems in humans walking. That's the core reason why our hips shrunk.
Oh. Yeah, I
So
guess because men don't have wide hips. So basically, if you don't need to give birth to children, there seems to be no reason to have very wide
I
hips
mean, we risk the child and the mother's wife with our smaller
with
hip.
narrow hips. Yeah. Yeah.
Yes, and this was something that we evolved out of after, descending from the trees, but what was the real pressure that caused this? And when we say medical technology, people would be like, what sort of medical technology coincides with the invention of farming? And
Right.
this is, and I think it's what many people the ability to stay in one place with somebody who is injured and bring them water and food. Like, you may
Mm.
not see that as a miraculous medical technology, but it's a pretty big medical technology to somebody who's just undergone a very difficult pregnancy.
Yeah.
Can they rest for 2 weeks in one location? And that is, it appears to be what led to the reduction here. Interesting, right?
That is fascinating.
Any thoughts before I go further on any of this?
No, I wanna hear more.
Now we're getting into some really spicy stuff. Bipolar disorder. So bipolar disorder, you see, go down a ton in the early agricultural period, but just continue to go down until modern times. Was this accelerating?
Yeah, what's
Um,
going on? Why would there be more bipolar people in the past?
I'm assuming
Like,
the
manic
risky
periods are really good
decisions.
for food storage? I'm
Yeah.
I'm I'm pulling here.
I'm assuming the risky decision making led to higher amounts of pregnancy, or
Or because, maybe there were more expendable people in a population, at least some of them were gonna make risky bets that really paid off, high risk, high reward.
yeah. So that could be it. Well, I mean, a high risk is running away with somebody, starting a new tribe, having way too many kids.
Yeah.
All of those things may have been rewarded historically. Now, it also might be tied to bipolar's correlation to schizophrenia. So you can also
Which
see
also went down over time. That's so interesting, but I see that more as like, oh, maybe schizophrenic people in the past had more of a role in society because they were seen as spiritual leaders. They heard voices, they saw things
No,
that
I
other
I
people
think that's
didn't.
absolutely what we're seeing here is, historically speaking, schizophrenic people were spiritual leaders, and currently schizophrenic, there's just like almost no advantage right now, I think, to having a ton of schizophrenia.
Mm,
Other than maybe a better ability to read other people if you have like prodromal levels of it, i.e.
mm.
prodromal levels of the genetic precursors. Whereas the opposite of schizophrenia, you can see our autism versus schizophrenia, what actually causes this video, where I go into, as somebody who studied these spaces as a scientist, as a neuroscientist. Somebody got so mad about that video when I argued that they're essentially opposites, that they're like, you need to take this down. This doesn't
Oh,
fit the narrative. This is
ooh.
malpractice. But anyway, the that particular video, we argue that these things are genetically like very distant from each other, and might actually be opposites in like a really high theory of mind and a very low theory of mind. But now I have a different understanding of autism, which is autism is partially a low theory of mind, but it's mostly caused by by neural density in certain regions, which we'll do a separate episode on. When one of our fans sends us, I told him to email us the piece that he did on this because it was really good, but I just didn't put it in my notes because it's like he's going to email it to us. Anyway, but it causes hypersensitization really easily. So if you're in any sort of environment where you have a lot of stimuli, you're going to do very badly, and you're going to need to separate yourself from that, and you're not going to fully process everything, but you're able to process narrow bands of stimuli much better and longer and with less burnout. And that this is hyper optimized for the online world, to the extent where, like, again, my wife is diagnosed autistic, my kids are diagnosed autistic. I will say I think a few things are called autism right now, but I think that one of the things we call autism, whatever the thing is that you have and Elon has and a lot of other like really successful people have, is like the most optimized iteration of the human condition right now for the online environment and the work at home environment that's created. And I think when we joke about, like, at the prenatalist convention, a really disproportionate of autistic people, like, are autists going to replace other people? I don't know, but I could see that happening, with schizophrenics being less and less useful in our current population. And we can see the downsides to this. I've pointed out where I would point out Simone on like one side of like the extreme autism spectrum, and I might be in the middle. If you go to the side of me on the schizophrenia spectrum, you're going to get like a Rubyard type character who I really, really, really respect as an intellectual. But I think we can see the negative consequences which can come from having, like, basically telling your AI to creativity max every decision they're making. It's going to lead to some interesting ideas you hadn't thought of, but it's going to also lead to some very poor decisions occasionally, which shows why that's selected against in modern times. And I note here that I don't even see what happened with him as that big of a deal. I mean, first, you've got to remember, Rubyard's like 23. He's basically a kid. Like, imagine if every bad ayahuasca trip you ever took at 23 was videotaped for the entire internet to see. With a lot of this is just like, oh, we caught a kid doing kid-like things, like somebody like Pearl Davis, right? Like, Pearl Davis is a kid, okay? She makes the types of mistakes that kids make when they're exploring the boundaries of what's normal. I'd actually say that I'm actually disconcerted by the young influencers who don't make these kinds of mistakes, like Brett Cooper. Like, it's weird that Brett Cooper never accidentally pushes things too far. So in a way, I find this stuff humanizing to the young influencers who make the types of mistakes I would have made if I had this level of notoriety at their age. In fact, I'd go farther and find it shocking that he hasn't gotten involved in more scandals. I just ask you to think, if you were 23 and had 500,000 people watching like almost every video that you're uploading, would you not push it too hard and flirting with some of your fans? Would you not, you know, is there no boundary that you would cross? How is this the only time he's really fucked up and overcrossed a boundary? How is the only boundary that he's crossed the very boundary that people show up to his show for, which is drawing insane connections between things and out there ideas? I mean, that's what you signed up for if you're following him.
But I think the greater replacement theory has a lot more weight than other people might feel comfortable admitting.
With the autist replacing? Yeah, I mean, it's just hyper optimized if you're in any sort of elite cast within today's
Well,
society.
I love this idea too of having a lot of kids being a lot of autists' new special interest. I am here for that.
Here's one that you're going to find really interesting is walking pace.
Yes. Why would we start walking faster? I mean, I guess this I would
Energy
assume more broadly.
conservation. There is no point to energy conservation in an industrialized society,
Yeah.
and little point to energy conservation in a society once you have agriculture.
Okay, so this is about energy conservation. That makes a lot more sense.
And you can see, like me, I'm hyper on walking speed, like just everything.
Yeah.
I remember thinking as a kid, like, why don't people run everywhere? And I did that for a long time. Just whenever I have to go places, I always run because I'd be like, well, why wouldn't you run? It's faster. It's healthy. You know, and you have to go between two locations, just run.
Yeah, and your family constantly haranguing you about the fact you're constantly like twitching and fidgeting, and that ultimately
burning calories.
burning
constantly,
calories. Yeah.
Now, this next one is one of the most controversial from this, but I found it really interesting, is intelligence. You can see a huge spike of intelligence post agriculture. And all
This I just feel like is humans optimizing more. I mean, I would expect on average for humans to broadly get more fit over time because you have more time to select for stuff that is more competitive, and intelligence seems to be one of those things that is broadly more competitive. Is that what you think? Is not you have something else in
no,
mind?
it's about calorie conservation. Again, intelligence is actually really calorie heavy. And so once you have the calories to begin optimizing around intelligence, and I also think intelligence is more useful to, if you're a hunter gatherer people, you just have to be good at catching the prey, right? And spending less calories than your neighbor. And calorie conservation is really important to hunter gatherers in a way that I do not think that people really think through. Just how you don't get the gain that week. You may eat once a week, at times. You may eat once a month at times, right? Like, you need to be able to be that snake if you want to survive, especially in the winter when you don't have full food preservation methods and stuff like that. So it made sense to really be restrictive on this stuff, where as soon as we became sedentary and farming, intelligence allowed you to, for example, in business interactions, in local politics, begin interacting in these large groups to outcompete your rivals. And here I note that what does this mean about groups that didn't develop farming? Sorry, I didn't ask that question. I'm just saying, if there were any groups, what conclusions could we draw from Europeans before they developed farming? which is
Okay,
to
now I see
say,
where this gets controversial. But I guess one theme that you're pointing out here that I didn't think was going to be the theme was basically what effect does the presence of agriculture or civilization in general have on our genetics? And it seems to be more about energy conservation and where we store our energy, and less
yeah.
about a bunch of other factors that I would generally expect. Like if you'd ask me to make predictions around the trends that we're showing, I would expect to just see, okay, in general, people are getting smarter and more healthy and more fit. And instead, it is more like humans are adapting to their environment, and they are living now in an environment that has exogenous food storage, an environment where they don't need to conserve energy as much and they have to compete on other factors. And that is really interesting because we can start asking questions about what our future environment is going to put in terms of selective pressures on us and how we're going to change in the future because of that.
Yes. Now, the next one, very spicy as well, is household income. So, this is what's correlated. So, these are the genetic correlates to household income within a 24th century environment. Obviously, we don't know if these had the same correlation to whatever the equivalent of household income would have been 6,000, 10,000 years ago. Well, actually, I think we can see by this, and we do know that they were less correlated with this. They were less correlated with genetic success historically, because they began to become selected for more and more recently. And what's really interesting here is you see basically after the fall of Rome, do you see the big dip in this? So after the fall of Rome, they began to have genetic selection for whatever the inverse of yeah.
Yeah.
And you see this
Well, but
dip in
that showed up in Kierkegaard's research as well when they were looking. Wasn't it Kierkegaard or was it someone else when they were looking at polygenic risk scores adjacent to educational attainment and found that around the fall of Rome that dropped. So that this is showing up in other people's research as well. That
Yeah,
as
you can sort of genetically exhaust a population and create an environment. Why the fall of Rome matters is because there's a lot of analogs to the fall of Rome and the genetic effects that may have been had at the peak of Roman civilization and our current civilization of the wealthy or elite caste having very, very few kids because they can just indulge in the pleasures of this world instead of focusing on the next generation or society or any sort of true moral good. You'll also notice a drop in walking pace after the fall of the Roman Empire. Hold on, I want to look. Did we get a drop in whiteness? No, didn't affect pigmentation. Interesting. Now, where the fall of the Roman Empire was really big in its effects is the genetic correlates to being a current smoker.
yeah, this just seems out of left field. Why were they looking at this? I mean, does it have to do with oral fixations that people have or the need for
I
stimulation?
imagine it's addiction to specific pathways. My family, for example, has a lot of addictive tendencies, but not to smoking. Naltrexone does not work on smoking. It's a unique addictive pathway. Something about this pathway was very advantageous in times of difficulty. You see it shooting up after the fall of the Roman Empire, and you see it shooting up, when some groups were beginning to develop agriculture, but before they all had, which is really interesting pattern here. I'd also note that with schizophrenia, we also see a big jump in the schizophrenia genes with the fall of the Roman Empire, which is interesting.
Yeah,
And then
well,
it
I
goes
feel
up
like it's going back
dramatically
to
with industrialization.
super soft religion, to your point, right?
Sorry, I realize this requires some context. So, super soft religion, what she's talking about here, is in the Pragmatist Guide to Crafting Religion, we describe religions existing on a spectrum from hard to soft, where a hard religion is, has a strict dress code, maybe even has a different language associated with it, has very large differentiators from the rest of society, and a lot of very strict rules. Whereas softer religions would be something like Unitarian Universalism would be a great example of a soft religion, or Reformed Judaism would be a soft religion. Now, a super soft religion is a very specific religion. So super soft is what we argue happens when you drain all of the religion out of a pool, and you basically are looking at the pre-evolved religious instincts in humans, where you'll get fetish worship, and by this I don't mean like sexual fetishes, I mean like figures that you assign spiritual value to. You begin to categorize people very similar to star signs, stuff like that. You begin to basically modern Wiccanism is very similar to a super soft religion, but these will reappear whenever you drain the built up religious foundation of a region and look at what's underneath that ocean. And we saw a period of flourishing super soft religions after the collapse of the Roman Empire. And as I suppose should be obvious, people will assume if somebody's seeing visions and they're of a super soft religion, that that person has access to some sort of extra degree of truth that other people do not have access to. And so they will elevate people with schizophrenia or schizophrenia-related symptoms to higher social status, allowing these genes to be adaptive rather than maladaptive. Whereas we are currently, I think, civilizationally moving into a period where people who have fallen for super soft religions are having virtually no children. And the only people who can really motivate reproduction are those who are incredibly mentally disciplined and ignore random errant mental signals of the type that are associated with schizophrenia.
Yeah. And now to the final one here, years of schooling or educational attainment. So you see here, it goes up a ton with the agricultural revolution, then continues to go up, and then you get the collapse in it as the fall of the Roman Empire, and then you get it rising again in modern times. Now, note, all of these things, intelligence, years of schooling, all this are declining in their genetic pool. Like all of these markers right here, we can look at how many people, these people are having, and they're declining dramatically. If you look at our video of Is an Idiocracy Possible, we're likely looking at a 1 standard deviation decline in things like IQ within just the next 75 years. So dramatic. But historically, they've been going up. And there was this narrative, which I kind of believed it. I was like, is it true that people become sort of civilized and the civilizing forces tame them and leave them impotent? Right? Because historically, whenever people like blew up onto the stage, they typically came from a population that civilization hadn't overly molested yet. Whether they are the Arabs with the Islamic Revolution, or the Vikings, or the original Romans, or the people like, what, the Romans didn't. You've read the Greek and myths and the the myths from the Middle East and the myths from the. Nobody was talking about what was going on in friggin' Rome back then. It was like a total barbarian backwater place. Or the Macedonians coming out of a backwater place. It seemed to me that genetic fitness was hampered by civilization, which the Rome timeline here could be arguing. But I actually noticed that a lot of the hits from Rome, well, they seem to start a bit before 2,000 years ago, so a bit before the time of Christ. So yeah, it does seem that like the ultra bureaucracy of Rome ended up with a collapse of a lot of dysgenic collapse here. And I love when people are being like, oh, that's so arrogant to say it's dysgenic, because it was eugenic within that particular context. And I can mean, well, yeah, but like it's obviously dysgenic in a broader world context. Like, you can be like, oh, when the bunnies have no natural parasites, it is eugenic to become big cancerous blobs that have no, it's like, yeah, but the moment a predator comes in, they're all going to go extinct that adapted those genes. So thoughts, Simone?
I'm a little concerned about where we are in society now then. I mean, if we're talking about generally not healthy things being more likely to be prevalent in future populations.
Mhm.
But where we are with science means that we can intervene.
Yeah.
With anything from germline editing to PGTP. So maybe I'm not so worried. I don't know, but that is interesting.
Yeah, I mean, hopefully we can fix this before the civilization falls off a cliff here.
Well, yeah, I mean, theoretically, relatively soon, we can just edit out baldness. We can just edit out predisposition to be unhealthily overweight, predisposition to be addicted to smoking, predisposition to have damaging low levels of intelligence, etc.
Yeah. Oh, by the way, an interesting one here is over 6,000 years, blood type B also exploded in commonality.
Huh. Yeah. What's going on there? It's not like anyone was doing.
Well, it has to do with something, probably some disease risk. But here's a fun one. You're talking about editing genes. That's one of the things that people are like, what sort of things is a Hard EA Foundation? If I was going to donate money to this foundation, what sort of things are you investing in? One of the things that we have already funded is a project designed to edit adult human DNA. So whether you want to invest in that project, you can let us know and we can connect you with the team. And I think it's one of the more competent efforts right now. There's a number of efforts and we're aware of them, and we invested in this one because we think it's one of the most likely to be promising. We might be actually invested in 2 companies doing that with the nonprofit. But point being is we are trying to make this stuff a reality, not just talking about making it a reality. And hardea.org, by the way.
Yeah, this stuff matters. We have to rise above it. It is clear, especially given how I think plausible your theories are around these different tendencies and traits arising mostly reactively in response to our environments. That again, like you say in The Pragmatist Guide to Crafting Religion and other books of ours, that evolution is a lazy or dumb programmer. Like it's going to reuse stuff. It's not going to be very efficient or intentional about anything. We should be intentional about it. We should be thinking thoughtfully, not what will the future shape us to be, but what do we want to be? What should we be? And in the discussion of things like germline editing and designer babies and polygenic risk score selection, there's a lot of discussion about, oh, won't it be terrible if people select for this or that? And people make a lot of assumptions around what people will select for. But I don't think people are having a lot of very productive conversations about what people should or likely will be selecting for. There are concerns people are going to select for only super intelligence and height and aggression and sort of specials in Scott Westerfeld's Ugly series, just these like terrifying, strong, sociopathic, superhuman
we will
monsters.
be, but
obviously that's our thing. But like Jonathan Anomaly has found in his research, people are primarily selecting for kindness, prosociality. And I mean, intelligence certainly correlates with that, but that's also because, intelligence correlates with higher health, whether that be because it's tied to those things just in general, or because also intelligent people are more conscientious, more likely to go, brush their teeth every night and go to doctor checkups and try to eat healthy foods. So there's actually a research that I found last night that I was reviewing that was going over basically that rationality and intelligence are extremely correlated. If someone behaves rationally, it is probably because they are very intelligent. So yeah, I mean, people should be selecting for intelligence, but people are also going to be selecting for kindness and prosociality, and all these things in the end are connected. So if someone just wanted someone who was super kind, they were probably going to end up with one of their more intelligent or a more intelligent human anyway. It's just kind of going to work out that way. But yeah, I don't know. I would rather we take ownership of what we want rather than reactively become things just because humanity is next to a refrigerator now, or now that humanity has smartphones.
Well, and this is a great thing about them being like, well, that's not really eugenic. Whatever wins in the moment is eugenic. And what I would say is, okay, your population can take that hypothesis, and our population will take the hypothesis that eventually these things will be eugenic, and we'll see in 1,000 years which population ends up going to the stars and which one returns to the woods. Like it doesn't take you don't have to be big brain to see where this is heading long term if you take this incredibly lackadaisical approach to something that I think that we really, now that we have the capacity to, have a responsibility to take responsibility for.
Yeah. Rise above, people. Rise above. We don't have to be animals.
Well, anyway, I love you to death, Simone. What are we doing for dinner tonight?
I was going to saute some onions and add some of the slow cooker meat that we have sort of saved, add that to coconut rice. And
could you cook that with coconut milk and Penang?
I can.
Remember to mix up the Penang in the coconut milk.
Coconut milk before I add anything else. I can do that. Do you still want sauteed onion? And if so, do you want
I
ribbons or
don't need the
confetti?
onion that sauteed. I'm okay if the onion adds a bit of crunch. Like, onion is not
Okay.
something you need to go overboard about making sure it's cooked. If you're
All
doing
right.
caramelized onion, yes, but no, like nobody, and this is the conspiracy of caramelized onion. This is something I've gone on about before, but people need to know. It takes 30 minutes to caramelize an onion. Any recipe that tells you you're caramelizing an onion before 30 minutes is just creating a soggy onion.
Well, anyway, okay, so you want lightly sauteed onion added to the meat and coconut milk after the penang is fully dissolved within it. Do you want ribbons or confetti?
For onion, ribbon, confetti.
Confetti. Okay, cool. All right. Well, then I will get that started. I love you so much. And I'll see you
Love you too.
downstairs. As a reminder, everyone, please don't miss NatalCon this March in Austin. It is going to be amazing. We're going to be there. A lot of really incredible, cool people are going to be there. And you can get a 10% discount on your registration by entering the word Collins at checkout.
All right. Anything you learned today, Simone?
Yeah, actually, I thought this was really interesting because this is relevant from the perspective of where culture and religion has an impact that actually matters. So there's a preprint. I don't know how they actually pronounce their name, but it's titled "The Freedom to Believe in Free Will: Evidence from an Adoption Study Against the First Law of Behavioral Genetics." So as you and I know, and most of our listeners know, most of the things that we do and believe end up being really heritable.
Yeah, somebody thought we
genetic.
were blank slatist in the Discord today.
That's
I was like,
wild.
that's
That
the
is,
furthest
yeah.
thing from the truth possible.
We acknowledge that we are definitely not blank slatists, and most research has found most of the stuff people end up doing is really heritable when you separate twins at birth.
I understand what he meant by that.
Oh yeah.
Well, yeah, so I think that some HBD bros are so obsessed with ethnic non-blank slatism that they
Oh,
are confused when somebody isn't an ethnocentrist non-blank slatist.
that's interesting.
Anyway,
Anyway, what this research found was one of the few things that is not genetically determined, is at very best very, very weakly correlated to our genetics, is belief in free will. So the context and culture in which you're raised, the religion in which you're raised, is going to affect your belief in free will and predetermination. And I think something you can extrapolate from that too is, I think to a certain extent, that will affect your internal or external locus of control.
Yeah.
And it means that religion and culture really does matter from that perspective, because the way that you contextualize and believe in and think about things like free will, predetermination, and your role in the larger universe really does affect your action.
Well, what
regardless
it
of other
means is
things
that you
you
could
inherit.
have Calvinist cultural clusters, which it believes in predestination, and some people see that as invalidating free will,
Mm.
is you could have cultural clusters where individuals who lived alongside these communities, and they often lived alongside different Christian factions, would disproportionately convert to the community, where people who didn't have this genetic cluster would disproportionately convert out, which can lead to a genetic vortex really quickly, really, really strengthening a view like this, which I think is why some people like us find it so easy to hold views around predestination, where other people who haven't been through this genetic washing machine around this find it to be so absolutely perplexing and difficult to engage with as a concept.
Yeah.
Very interesting. Well, so here's what he said I thought was interesting. So one of our most hated episodes ever we did today. Did you get to the comments, by the way?
No, that's gonna have to be tonight, thing, it turns out.
Okay, well, anyway, it was the H1B visa episode, and I did not expect. I thought like people knew our stance on this. Like I was like, we've signaled this many times, but what I've come to realize is the real reason why this is so spicy. Because I was like, our audience is like the tech right? You know, like it's not like, you know. And that video only had an 80% upvote ratio, which is very low for us. We almost never break below 90%.
Yeah.
And a normal is like 97 to 95% upvote.
My God.
So, and we do controversial topics too, you know? So this was like, why? And then I got it. I was like, oh my God, when I was talking with her about this, H1B visas seem like the smartest thing ever if you are a tech right elite, i.e. you are an entrepreneur or you are a VC or you run a company. But if you are a tech right rank and file, you are it's literally about your job and your income.
Yeah.
But because the tech
Yeah.
right sorts its sort of like who you're going to hear from in the movement based on their proven competency at building and running companies, the ones with the pro H-1B visa are the ones you're going to hear from, where all of the masses, like on Twitter or among our fans, are going to be the ones who are predominantly affected by this.
That's rich, because what I've seen a lot of people on Twitter talking about is, well, that we also need low skilled workers too. Who's gonna, I can't do my job as a tech worker if there isn't some nanny to watch my kids, and I need an immigrant to do that work. And they just want someone else's job to be taken, it seems like. I don't know. I honestly think that when it comes to a lot of the domestic work or whatever, like unwanted jobs that people want immigrants to complete, I'm more of the mind that either you should be doing that yourself or you should be doing that domestically, leaving that for low skilled people in the United States, because we've taken all those jobs away. And I'm much more of the mind that we really need to bring in high skilled, high tax paying
I don't know.
labor.
I'm
But
actually moderating my views on this in response to the comments, because they're like, look, you got to look into how many of these people are lowering the price that you would pay to American coders.
hmm,
But here I wonder if that's really true. Like large bureaucratic forms, it probably is. Whereas like for us, like we hire our coding teams in Africa, like I'm like, why not just outsource entirely, right? Their living costs are in Africa. But the thing I was going to ask you, or no, the other thing he mentioned, which I thought was really big for me, is he was pointing out, and like I didn't realize this, but it's totally true, is it was in like the center of the trans community. They've already accepted that this is mostly a social phenomenon. And this happened with the fight between the Too Cutes and the True Scums. And we'll do a separate episode on this. But the True Scums were the ones who wanted to medicalize transness, and the Too Cutes were the ones who say, no, anyone who chooses to be trans can choose to be trans.
okay.
And I was like, oh, that's really true. I do remember that fight, but I hadn't contextualized it as them accepting that this is a social phenomenon. And then, I realized, and he was pointing out to me, he goes, yeah, but also what this creates is a phenomenon in which the Too Cutes, who ended up winning, you can't have something like transness where you can't actively talk about targeting someone for recruitment, like this idea of an egg, and then potentially recruiting them. And you're not doing that, if you believe that this is all biological, you're not going to target people for recruitment in the same way, because you're going to think, well, they'll come to it, but if you're going to go out there and basically hunt for people, and you can see this in their internal message boards, it makes a lot of sense. And I was like, yeah, actually that's true. That's going to grow much faster as a movement than the iterations that denied that like you can really convert anyone who's socially isolated and autistic if you try hard enough.
Oh, that's fascinating.
All right.
Okay. I like our talks.
All right. All right, let's go. Okay. Whoa, what did you make here? Ah! Octavian, what did you make here? This is huge. Oh, that's your fire exit in case there's a fire?